don't remain a nerd. Enjoy life. There is more to a designer's life than just being a car nerd, because that's what a chief designer ultimately is looking for, a mature person to come into your team.
Hello and welcome to the CDE Podcast. Today we're talking with Achim Anscheidt. He is the former head of design at Bugatti. Hello Achim, how are you today?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. You gave a wonderful presentation just this morning on the history of Bugatti, which was absolutely spellbinding. We're going to talk about Bugatti and your career in a moment, but I'm going to start each of these interviews by asking all our guests the same handful of questions, which are specifically, hopefully, going to get some interesting answers for design students that might be listening to these podcasts. So first things first, where are you from originally, and how far back can you trace your passion for cars and design?
I'm born originally in Stuttgart, or in the Stuttgart area. And I grew up being my dad's kid, meaning my dad was a motorcycle racer in the 60s. And I grew up in the pit lane of Spa, Francorchamps, Monza, Nürburgring. So this was my upbringing. And then in my teenage years, I discovered a passion also for drawing and perspective specifically. And by 15, 16, I realized, hey, I might be able to combine those two things to a profession. There are actually people making money on that pleasure. And then I was sold.
I believe you spent most of your 20s as a motorcycle acrobat. Is that correct? I've done some Googling. So that's extraordinary. It's an incredible career. I think a lot of people feel like, especially with quite a vocational career like design, you have to go straight into it or it's too late. Do you feel that in some ways you benefited from coming into design later on in life, relatively speaking?
Yes. Before I lose focus on that, it's actually, I still believe today, I don't necessarily, no matter what the talent is, want to have a designer in my team that is only 19 years old. Even if he's a hotshot, I want a designer joining my team that is, of course, a hotshot, if you want to say so, but has seen the world and has understood how certain things and principles work in life and has tried a lot of things and had a lot of, excuse my French, fuck-ups as well, which you need, in design and in life as well, to learn, to gain experience. And I think that's a designer then that can start identifying also with the nature of our clients. It was similar with me. Don't worry, I had my major fuck-ups as well in life. You have to beep that out, I'm afraid. But my father being a motorcycle racer, I grew up in trials riding when I was 10, 11 years old, and I did that as a sport until 18, 19. And when it was about to decide what I really want to study, I was asked to perform that sport on various occasions. I think Doug Lemkin performed that very much in a similar way. But it was, of course, 30 years ago for me, or more than 35 years ago, so that it became a profession. Every weekend I would go to a different place that would have an opening, or a Tyler dealer or a Yamaha dealer, and I would perform there as a trials rider, and it became really something that allowed me also to finance my studies. And I did that from the age of 20 until 27. But in the wintertime, I always studied at the Pforzheim University until I met the chief designer of Porsche at that time, and we had a instant connection, Harm Lagai, and he also was a trials rider. He was fascinated by that sport. So we first talked for an hour about motorcycles, and then we talked about cars, and then he allowed me to go to Art Center College of Design and get a scholarship from Porsche, and then return to Porsche as my first job, which was a total honor in those days to see Weissach from the inside.
Absolutely. And a passion for motorcycles was the thing that brought you and Harm together initially.
Yes.
I had the privilege of interviewing him earlier this year at the other event, and he's such an interesting guy. I'm sure I heard a rumor that was it the Porsche 928, the V8 front engine model, that you could fit it with a tow bar. Was an option from the factory, and apparently the reason for that is because he used to tow his race car around, so he made sure that it was fitted with a tow bar. Yeah, I love that point you make about the value of, traveling and trying other things, just being a more well-rounded person and having more to then bring to not just design, but, being a good colleague, being someone that people want to work with.
Especially with a brand like Bugatti. I'm not a Bugatti client. Constantly, I meet people that say, "Well, are you driving a Bugatti? And did you get a company car?" Or I was just an employee, and so are the designers of my team were at the time. But you still have to be able to put yourself into the mindset, into the spirit, into the character of those clients, and be mature enough to think for them, and not just consider them as a nouveau riche clientele cliche, but really focus, what does this person do? Where are the passions for motoring? Where is it coming from? And you would be surprised how different Bugatti clients are, no matter where their wealth of independence comes from.
Well, let's talk a bit about Bugatti, because as I mentioned, you gave a wonderful presentation on the history of the brand this morning. You are a Bugatti geek. I hope you don't mind me saying. It's obvious that as a former head of design there, you would be passionate and interested about the history. But I mean, it was evident in that presentation. You are deeply interested and extremely educated in the history of this brand. Now that you've stepped away from the company after a long spell there, have you had a chance to kind of reflect on your time and sort of realize that you've contributed a very successful chapter into this incredible brand story? Is that kind of sunk in now?
Now that I'm retired, it starts to sink in what a privilege and a pleasure it was to be responsible for 20 years for the development, for the design development. In regards to the link to history, there is very often a saying that the better you understand the past and the history, the longer you can look into the future. And especially at Bugatti, that is very true. The inner heritage of Bugatti is the artistic family Bugatti that it always was, and Ettore Bugatti being such a different character from a Enzo Ferrari, from a W.O. Bentley, from a Ferdinand Porsche. Just the way how he saw his life, his passion, his company. Things had to be the way how Mr. Bugatti wanted it to be, or it did not happen at all. Therefore, it still had the spirit of Bugatti in pre-war times that we need to relive today as well. Bugatti is the opposite of mass production, really. And it doesn't help us to look over the fence and see what Ferrari is doing, because we should not be compared to Ferrari. We are in our own little cosmos. And the program that Bugatti's just launched with the Solitaire, one-off coach building cars program, which was just introduced in Pebble Beach, shows that very much. We take care, if necessary, of one client with one car, developing one car just for that person or for that family. And that is what is Bugatti, what reflects Bugatti in its value pre-war as well as modern day Bugatti and in the future as well.
So when you have all this rich history and heritage to draw on as a designer, how do you then balance that with bringing your own stuff to the design, bringing something fresh and new and specific to you? Because it must be very daunting to change anything with a brand like that.
That's a very good point that you bring up, because it's easy to fall into the trap of retro design. Look at the Type 35 and the many students that thought about the future of Bugatti and thinking about it and then thinking, there should be a reincarnation of a Type 35. And then you end up with kind of a retro fuselage thing. Then it's more interesting to consider what was a Type 35 in its day in the 20s was the ultimate race car that everybody wanted and needed to have. So the interpretation of a modern day Type 35 is actually a race car, so to say, or a race car that eventually a normal person could also drive in a very extreme way. In a way, a bolide is that interpretation, the Bugatti bolide. So considering the heritage of Bugatti should not trap you into further evolutions of your brand then it becomes way more important. Where is the next step? Where do I need to go? Are we on a linear path with the brand, or do we need to break away? I would, for example, say the Tourbillon is a bit of an evolution of an icon. No? The Veyron is an icon, the Chiron is an icon, the Tourbillon needs to be an icon. And not just doing something different for the sake of, oh, I'm the new hotshot designer and it needs to look like this because styling-wise I feel like this. No. Actually, the hand signature of one designer is not important enough as the overall value of the brand, of the overall value of the product. The value comes from within, what it means to produce this kind of engine, this drivetrain, the overall production, the quality approach to these products, and not just a single line from a designer because the ego wants to handle it that way. That is relatively, excuse my French, cheap in that term. So the evolution there on a side that really represents the brand is important, but I can also tell you sometimes it's important to break away and break free of that. For example, with the interior development. It cannot be that we follow the digital trend on interiors because everybody else is doing this. And I wonder how that looks like in 30 years down the road, these enormous, plastic panels all through the car. Will they still be able to start up? I know that you have to do this, and I know that you have to venture into this if you are a volume seller. No doubt about it. But as Bugatti, this needs to be an authentic car 50 years down the road, sitting on the lawn of Pebble Beach, being authentic and valuable, and also the members of your family that will inherit that Bugatti will have to be able to use the car or appreciate the car and be fascinated by, in this case, a digital detox that we see on the Tourbillon on the interior.
Well, I'm very appreciative of the digital detox. Is it something that you would like to see on, just across the car industry, on smaller, more affordable vehicles as well? Or do you feel that this is just the way things are going and inevitably it's going to be more digital, less tactile?
No, I don't think it's for every brand. I think Bugatti can have a solitary viewpoint there, or is allowed to have a solitary viewpoint. I would appreciate that physical buttons are actually returning a little bit into interiors, but I think the approach of digital progress needs to be reflected in cars for volume sellers, for sure. Even Ferrari is a volume seller in our terms, so to say, or Aston Martin. So I think it's the right path for Bugatti, but in general, I feel what the watchmaking industry in the 70s, 80s with quartz watches, it sparked a moment for the industry of mechanical watches. And it made people aware how beautiful mechanical watches are. The victory for digital watches like the Apple Watch is certain. The victory for fully electrified cars in the midterm future is certain. But if you reflect on the watch development of the 80s, the quartz moment has brought mechanical watches back to life and the appreciation for that. And if you would, Bugatti is a little bit, in a way, comparable maybe to Patek Philippe or Parmigiani. If you would ask Patek Philippe to do a quartz watch, it would feel awkward. You appreciate a Patek Philippe for the business that they are in, for the fascination of mechanical watches.
And one hopes that in that same way that you've just described, there will be a place for exquisite, high-end combustion cars in an electric future. I certainly hope that there will be. Yeah,
but for that, it is good that you have a CEO, for example, with Mate Rimac, who I admire for the bravery to develop together with the shareholders a concept where you design a new V16 naturally aspirated engine. So it brings all the emotion of this kind of engine as a Saugmotor, naturally aspirated, also the noise, also the revs, all to 9,500 RPM. Replacing the turbos with a battery pack. Therefore, you get way more freedom how to do the packaging. And to be brave enough to do this in this day and age takes guts and glory, takes understanding how to bring shareholders for this idea on board. And therefore, I will be forever grateful to Malte Riemertz to be this kind of person, to have this knowledge, to be that kind of car person as well, and still being such a likable chap in the end.
Absolutely. I didn't expect many people to be engineering new V16s in the 2020s.
I would have never thought.
Very grateful for that. So Veyron was the first project that you were involved with. The wheels were already turning on that project by the time that you joined Bugatti, and you mentioned an astonishing lineup of designers who worked on that car and then went on to basically run the car industry. Chiron was very much your baby, as I understand it. That was the first one that you got to start from the very beginning. And you said something interesting in your presentation earlier about having a healthier relationship with the engineers for that project. Could you speak to that a little bit? Because from the outside as a journalist, I imagine the development as a car as like an argument between designers, finance guys, engineers, and eventually, you come to a compromise. But I guess it's much better off when it's not an argument, it's a collaboration, especially with such an engineering forward vehicle like any Bugatti is. Is it important as a great designer not only to be creative and imaginative, but to be able to have these good working relationships with the other departments?
Almost 2 or 3 questions in one here. As we're speaking to also a younger audience and design audience, it is essential that I do connect and have a good and healthy relationship with not only with my CEO, but also the chief of development and the chief marketing officer. Best is if you can have a beer in the evening with those guys to be certain about the targets where your company needs to go, and that they also understand what you need as a designer to get there, to get to good proportions, and what is essential to achieve those goals in design, but also understanding what are their goals in terms of monetary turnaround and delivering sustainable products and products with a fascination, and also responsible products for a chief of development. That is always, a lot of people think, the natural enemy of the designer, and the secret is that they are not. And that brings me to the point of Veyron development, Chiron development, and then Tourbillon development, because the Veyron and the Chiron are almost pretty much the same car, same power plant, same package, same monocoque, and same problems that the Veyron had in its time, which is mostly thermal management. The Tourbillon is a completely new car, so that was the more exciting and the bigger challenge for me, and also the bigger challenge for the team. Going back to Veyron to Chiron, the Veyron was developed in that way that Ferdinand Pirch was calling the shots, what the car should be capable of doing. 1,001 horsepower, faster than 400, incredibly difficult to achieve.
Take you to the opera in the evening.
First car over 1 million as well. Wonderful. And take it to the opera in the very end. So the ultimate GT, actually, and not the race car for the road. And at the same time, Hartmut Varkus, the head of Volkswagen Group Development, having such a good connection to Mr. Pirch and being able to insist on that this car needs to go into production exactly as it is. And that's why it also, amongst other things, took 7 years to develop this car into production, and not just the usual 3.5 to 4 years. But that also resulted in enormous thermodynamic problems on this car. The first prototypes were constantly burning, catching on fire. And there's a reason why when you take the skin away from a Veyron, underneath it looks like the development of Apollo 11, really. So, so intense, so many components in there. If you would drop a €1 piece on the top, it would not fall out on the bottom, which is very different from, a classic mid-engine Ferrari layout, let's say. So those problems became so severe when Ferdinand Pirch then for the Chiron demanded an increase of 50% of power, going from 1,000 horsepower to 1,500 with the intermediate step of the Supersport with 1,200 horsepower. And I also had my reservations just to restyle an icon like the Veyron just for styling's sake. Has to be a new model, has to look different. Yeah, it has to look different. But what's the best way then to go that next step without me feeling I'm superimposing my personal styling line on this? Going back to that subject that we just talked about. And the most authentic way was to look at the actual problems that the Veyron has in terms of thermal management, or had, it took so much to iron that out, and open the Chiron development up to be very purpose-driven in those areas. I give you one example. The C line that you have on the Chiron looks like a styling line from a designer. Oh, I want to have the line like this and do it like this. No, it's actually the opposite is the case. The upper area where the air goes around the cabin is the most precious area on the whole body side section of the Veyron. And the upper air that passes by the B pillar, that is the highest pressure that we find in this area, not the lower area in front of the rear wheel. The lower area is very turbulent. Almost no air really goes into these relatively big holes that the Veyron has. The upper area was really precious, and that's why we combined the big Bugatti line into this one line so that you can actually access, or the air can access everywhere along that line. So this is for me an authentic example of developing win-win situations with engineering. Plus, I had people and have people on my board and in the team, like with Frank Heil, my successor now at Bugatti, very much a person that can think. First of all, he can sketch like a plotter, freehand. You should see his sketchbooks, they're just wonderful. Then he sits down with engineers, and his brain is also very engineering focused. Where does performance come from? How to reduce drag but still create more downforce? All these things, you can sit down with engineers. Yes, you have to prove to the engineers that you know something about this. And I'm fascinated by this. My motorsport history with my dad allowed me to be fascinated by Formula One and technical development of Formula One. And in this case, Frank was one of those crucial members that developed that skill to sit down with the engineers and find win-win combinations. As a designer, you do not always have that privilege. If you work for a mass volume manufacturer, let's say Ford or so, you don't always have a chance to influence the package. There are so many constraints, and in the very end, money constraints, budget constraints. But at Bugatti, it's almost your duty to sit down, because we only have one core car, one icon to develop. It needs to be so thorough. You need to sit down with the chief of development, in this case, Emilio Cervo for the Tourbillon, and find that connection and that shoulder alignment, and to carry that through the whole program. That is key. That is gold in the development of a brand like Bugatti.
Absolutely. And again, that strikes me as something that all brands could learn from, actually. Again, not just really high-end manufacturers, but just having that kind of synergy between departments is surely always going to result in a better product, isn't it?
Helps, but if I look at modern Constellation where that really works well, if Porsche or also Volkswagen, I see, and it's essential that as a chief designer, maybe Andreas Mint for Volkswagen or Michael Mauer for Porsche, I see, or I saw in my active time, how good they are with their CEO, with their chief marketing officer, and with their development chief. Only that way you find a bond and almost like a friendship that you can have to march in a certain direction and then be strong about this direction and not getting disoriented along the way because there are too many doubters along the way. No, if the CEO, if those four people, they stick together, then I think you can achieve with a fascinating product.
Absolutely. And speaking of being decisive, a lot of your time at Bugatti was underneath Piech, who is a decisive man. I don't think there's many other people under whom Veyron could have happened. And just what you said a moment ago about him saying, now increase the power by 50% for the Chiron, astonishing. Another thing that struck me in your presentation this morning is all the cool projects that you guys worked on that didn't happen. You know, the Galibier, the boats, the six-cylinder sports car. I do a little bit of comedy and theatre as well as this, and there's a horrible saying in comedy. They say, "Don't be afraid to kill your babies," and it basically means whatever idea you have that you think is fantastic, don't get too attached to it, because it might not happen, and someone else might say no, and you have to accept that and be willing to move on. Is that important as a designer as well? You know, you put so much effort and passion into these pieces of work, but you also have to make peace with the fact that it may not see the light of day. How do you balance that?
Maybe by accepting as a car designer or as a designer in general that that is part of your designer's life. I mean, take another field like pharmaceutical. If you're a passionate doctor or a research scientist that researches there are so and so many things that you develop in a certain direction, they will never see the light of the day. And as a designer, it's the same thing. And as a designer, it's also part of your program that you screw up a couple of times or realize a couple of years later, man, maybe it wasn't such a good idea. I have tons of those projects and proposals. So where we had the feeling in the end, maybe it was a good thing that we didn't do it. But we felt at the moment that we had to go there and try something out. Plus, at least at Bugatti, it was our responsibility to look left and right everywhere in this whole field. What could be done after the Veyron, for example? What could be a possible successor? And would that replace the Veyron, let's say with a Galibier four-door limousine, that there would only be then the Galibier that would have continued further and to stop the Veyron? Or to do a second car, Veyron plus Veyron successor and Galibier going parallel. All this needed to be investigated, plus all the other things that you could envision Bugatti could have gone to. But again, it was the strong character of Ferdinand Piëch that said, okay, thank you for trying all these different directions. But I think for Bugatti, it's still the way to keep on going with a 16-cylinder engine, to concentrate on one iconic car, one iconic development. This will pay off in the future, and we develop the extraordinary for our precious customers. And there are not so many customers there. We have around, hopefully I'm allowed to say that, 350 to 400 customers worldwide.
I'm going to ask you a couple of questions to finish the interview that I'm going to ask to everyone. First of all, what do you regard as your own greatest strengths as a designer? I know what Mate Rimac thinks your greatest strengths are. He's praised your pursuit of perfection and your attention to detail in the past, which is very much reflected in your work. In your own words, what do you think are your biggest strengths as a designer?
To nurture talent, that I was able, and I learned this already when I was responsible for Volkswagen Advanced Design in Barcelona for a couple of years. It was there also my job to recruit new talent to come to Sitges in that time and work in that studio. So I was used already to spot talent in schools, universities, and maybe from the third or fourth semester on to support them all the way to their bachelor degree. Since I learned that there and be in so much contact with the schools and unis, I continued that on even at Bugatti to spot talent and to raise them to become a strong Bugatti design member, and to nurture that and to give those people a chance to shine and to bring a genius to life, so to say, to be able to show your qualities for the benefit of the brand. It's not important to hang on to that you've once been a fantastic designer. At one point, it becomes your responsibility, I feel, to nurture a young team, not just because it has to go to obviously it needs to pass on to young talent, but it's another thing to curate young talent to become mature, experienced designers that don't get carried away by just falling in love with their single line work, but building responsibility towards the brand, understanding the brand, creating win-win situations with all the peers that you need to have in the boat to create a successful product.
Well, that leads me beautifully into my final question, which is, what is your go-to piece of advice for young designers or aspiring young designers? What's the number one thing that you like to tell them?
Be a complete nerd about your passion. If you want to be a car designer, if you're speaking car designers, actually also for product designers, you just need to soak that up, to buy every book or every media outlet that you can find in digital days. There's so much to learn in the digital world today that you can spot and see. In my days, it took a lot. You had to buy all the magazines or travel to Geneva, where there was a fantastic art center outlet, to meet those people and look through the window. And you just need to be totally engulfed and totally swimming in that sea of information, no matter if other people call you a nerd or not about this. You need to look at everyday cars. When you drive the car, drive behind the car, then look at fenders, fender shapes, plan view to cabin, and all this you need to be endlessly investigating. And at the same time, don't remain a nerd. Enjoy life. There is more to a designer's life than just being a car nerd, because that's what a chief designer ultimately is looking for, a mature person to come into your team with life experience.
A well-rounded human being makes for a better designer.
Yes, and create some humor all around that.
Achim, thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening to this CDE podcast. Please like and subscribe to discover new episodes and upcoming events.